It was a warm summer night in New York City, the kind of evening that promised a gentle breeze but left a tingling sense of anticipation in the air. In the upscale penthouse overlooking Central Park, 75-year-old Charles Hawkins sat at his polished mahogany desk, his fingers lightly tapping the surface as he glanced at the papers before him. The overhead lights cast a soft glow, but even that couldn't mask the shadows in his eyes. Age had begun to creep in, and though his mind was sharp, his body was frail. The once powerful figure of Hawkins Industries, now worth billions, was slowing down, and he knew it. For the past year, his health had been in decline. Heart problems, diabetes, a broken hip. He'd been in and out of the hospital, and the doctors told him it was only a matter of time. He had no children, no heirs to his empire, except for his 35-year-old wife, Julia, a stunning woman with a calculated beauty. Julia had been by his side for 5 years, a union that many had called a match made in heaven. But in reality, it was more of a marriage of convenience, a convenient arrangement for Julia, who at the time of their wedding had been a struggling actress and artist, never close to the life she now led. She would often sit across from him, smiling sweetly, but her eyes would flicker toward the window, as if she were plotting her next move. To the outside world, Julia was the picture of devotion, the loving wife of a wealthy man. But inside, her mind churned with greed. For months, Julia had been approached by someone who knew how badly she wanted to control Hawkins Industries. A man named Victor, a known criminal in certain circles, had promised her a life of unimaginable wealth and power. He had a plan, a simple plan, a plan that involved her husband's untimely death. Julia had hesitated at first, but the idea of ruling the company, of stepping into Charles's shoes, was far too enticing. $5 million. That was the price for the life of her elderly husband. At first, Julia thought she could just wait it out. Charles's health was deteriorating after all. But as the days passed, she grew impatient. She began to grow more anxious. She needed more than just his slow death. She needed to speed up the process. Victor had promised her the money once Charles was gone, but Julia couldn't stand the thought of waiting. That night, she made a decision. She walked into the lavish bedroom where Charles lay in bed, watching the television, his pale face lit up by the flickering screen. He looked like a shadow of the man who had once been so full of life. "Charles, darling," she said, her voice soft and sweet, "you need to rest. You've been working too hard." He smiled faintly, weakly, and patted the bed beside him. "Come sit with me, Julia." "I'm not going anywhere just yet." But Julia knew what she had to do. She had to act, and she had to act fast. A couple of hours later, Charles was dead. A lethal dose of his prescribed medication, disguised as one of the many pills he took every day, had been enough. Julia had made sure the dose was just enough to be undetectable at first glance. Charles's sudden death sent shockwaves through the business world. Media outlets covered it for days, focusing on the mourning widow, Julia. The police ruled it a natural death at first, attributing it to his chronic health problems. But something didn't sit right with Detective Robert Mason, a seasoned investigator with the NYPD's homicide unit. He had been investigating high-profile deaths for years, and something about this one smelled fishy. Mason couldn't pinpoint why. It could have been the way Julia cried in front of the cameras, how composed she was. Or perhaps it was the fact that Charles's wealth seemed to be the one thing that Julia stood to gain. Whatever it was, Mason decided to dig deeper. Detective Mason walked into the Hawkins family home the following day, a cold cup of coffee in his hand. His eyes scanned the grandiose hallway, decorated with paintings and expensive artifacts. Julia stood at the door, her eyes red from the tears she had shed on camera. She wore an elegant black dress, a picture of mourning. "Detective Mason," she greeted him with a tearful smile, wiping her eyes. "I still can't believe it. Charles was everything to me. This house, this life, it feels so empty without him." Mason nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hawkins. I'm just here to ask a few questions. It's standard procedure after a death like this." Julia nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. "Of course. I'll do anything to help." Mason had been in this line of work long enough to recognize when someone was faking grief. Julia's composure seemed off, too composed for someone who had just lost their spouse of 5 years. "We spoke to your doctor. He mentioned Charles had been struggling with his health for a while," Mason began, flipping through his notebook. "Can you tell me about the day he passed?" Julia wiped another tear from her cheek and took a deep breath. "Charles had been feeling weak for a few days before he died. I gave him his medications as usual. He was always taking so many pills. I never thought anything was wrong. I went to bed early that night. When I woke up, he was gone." Mason scribbled down her words, his mind racing. There were details that didn't add up. Why had she been the one to give him the medication? Why not a nurse or a doctor, considering his condition? Why hadn't anyone else been there to confirm the timeline of events? "Were you with him the entire night?" Mason asked, his voice calm but probing. "I was," she replied, her voice quivering slightly. "We had talked about his will and his business plans earlier that day, but I never imagined he'd pass so suddenly." Mason glanced at the trophy on the mantel. "And his business, Hawkins Industries. You're set to inherit everything now, I assume?" Julia's face flushed slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Yes, of course. I'll manage it, though. It's a lot to take on, but Charles would have wanted me to." Mason noticed the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him suspicious. "All right, Mrs. Hawkins," Mason said. "We'll be in touch with any further questions. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you remember anything else." Julia nodded and led him to the door. "Thank you, Detective. I'm just so lost right now." As Mason stepped out into the cool New York night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Julia's perfect facade was hiding something darker. He needed to dig deeper. Something about this case was not as simple as it seemed. Detective Mason spent the next few days poring over the details of Charles Hawkins's death. The medical examiner's report, the initial police investigation, and even the details of the late billionaire's health all seemed to fit the narrative of a natural death caused by his deteriorating condition. But Mason wasn't convinced. He had seen too many cases that started out looking like accidents or natural causes, only to be uncovered as something far more sinister. Mason sat in his office at the NYPD headquarters, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk as he reviewed the case files once more. There was something about Julia's story that didn't add up. It was the way she had spoken about Charles's health, the way she had described the final hours of his life. Mason had seen it before. People who faked grief, people who had too much to gain from someone else's death. But Julia Hawkins had been convincing, too convincing. He decided to take a closer look at the woman who had been married to Charles for 5 years. Julia Hawkins was born in a small town in Pennsylvania, the daughter of an average middle-class family. Her rise to prominence had been quick, too quick. A struggling actress turned socialite, Julia had married Charles after only a year of dating. While their marriage had appeared to be one of love, there were whispers in the industry about Julia's ambition, about her hunger for more than just a comfortable life. Mason knew there was more to this than met the eye. The next morning, Mason met with his trusted colleague, Detective Sarah Thompson, to go over the case. Sarah had been in the department for years and had a sharp eye for detail. Mason trusted her instincts, so when he shared his suspicions about Julia, she immediately agreed to help him dig deeper. "The woman has motive, Robert," Sarah said, sipping her coffee as she leaned over the stack of files. "She's young, attractive, and now she inherits a multi-billion-dollar empire. It's too neat, too perfect." Mason nodded, rubbing his chin. "And don't forget the $5 million. That's a hell of a price to pay for someone's life." Victor, the man Julia has been dealing with, could be the key to unraveling this. Victor, as Mason discovered, was no stranger to crime. He had a history of involvement in various illegal activities, including blackmail and organized crime. The fact that he was connected to Julia was a red flag. It wasn't uncommon for people to be pushed into illegal dealings when they thought they could gain something. But in Julia's case, it seemed all too orchestrated. Mason decided to speak with Julia's former acquaintances, anyone who might have known her before her marriage to Charles. It didn't take long to find someone who had worked with her in her earlier acting days. Her former manager, Lisa Taylor, was the first person to offer a glimpse into Julia's true nature. "She always wanted to be famous," Lisa recalled when Mason met with her. She was determined to be somebody. I think she married Charles because she knew it would give her access to a different world, a world of wealth and power. Did she ever mention anything about Charles's business? Mason asked, his eyes narrowing. Lisa hesitated before answering. Not directly, but there were times when she'd talk about how much easier her life would be if she didn't have to worry about money anymore. If only she could get her hands on what Charles had built. Mason's suspicion grew stronger. He thanked Lisa for her time and left her apartment, his mind racing. It was starting to look like Julia had been playing the long game, slowly positioning herself to take control of Hawkins Industries. The $5 million was likely just the beginning. The true wealth lay in the company itself, and Julia was about to inherit it all. The following day, Mason met with the financial experts at the NYPD to go over Charles's business dealings. Hawkins Industries was a conglomerate with vast holdings, from tech companies to luxury real estate. The company's stock had been on the rise and its future looked promising. But what struck Mason was a series of strange transactions that had occurred in the months leading up to Charles's death. A large sum of money had been transferred into an account under Julia's name just weeks before Charles's passing. The transaction was listed as a gift, but it was unusually large. The investigators could find no record of the source. It didn't take long for Mason to realize that the money could have been the payout for the life insurance policy that Charles had taken out shortly before his health began to deteriorate. Mason's gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. Charles's sudden decline in health seemed too convenient, and now with the financial transactions pointing to Julia's involvement, Mason knew he had to act quickly. If Julia had truly orchestrated her husband's death, she would have gone to great lengths to cover her tracks. But Mason was ready to unravel her web of lies. In the meantime, Julia continued to play the role of the grieving widow. She appeared in front of the press, tearfully speaking about her late husband's legacy and her plans to continue his work. But Mason knew better. Every word she spoke was a calculated move to cement her position as the rightful heir to Hawkins Industries. Mason gathered his team and began working on a strategy to bring Julia in for questioning. It wasn't enough to simply rely on the financial records. He needed physical evidence, something that would tie Julia to her husband's death in a way that no amount of wealth could cover up. Late one night, Mason sat in his office, staring at the case files. He had a sense of where this was heading, and he knew it would be dangerous. Julia was clever, and if she suspected the investigation was closing in on her, she might do anything to protect herself. Mason needed to get ahead of her before she made her next move. The investigation was beginning to gain momentum, and Detective Mason could feel the walls closing in on Julia Hawkins. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that her involvement in Charles's death was not a simple coincidence. The sun was setting over the New York skyline, casting an orange hue over the city's streets as Detective Mason sat in his office. He had spent the past few days piecing together the puzzle, each new discovery slowly but surely leading him closer to the heart of the mystery. Julia Hawkins' perfect life, the image of the grieving widow, was beginning to crack, and Mason could see the cracks widening. The financial records from Hawkins Industries were troubling. Large sums of money had been transferred under suspicious circumstances, but it wasn't just the money that bothered him. It was the pattern of behavior that Julia had exhibited ever since Charles's death. She had appeared so calm, so composed, even in the face of a loss that should have been devastating. Her public persona seemed rehearsed, calculated. The media loved her, but Mason wasn't fooled. The breakthrough came when he received a tip from an unlikely source, a former employee at Hawkins Industries who had worked in the finance department. The employee, a man named Jonathan Pierce, had recently left the company after a long tenure. He had worked closely with Charles Hawkins, handling much of the financial oversight for the company. He had left after a heated argument with Julia shortly before Charles's death, and he seemed eager to talk. Mason arranged a meeting with Jonathan at a small diner on the edge of the city. When Jonathan arrived, he looked worn, disheveled, and nervous, as though he had been carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders for months. "Detective Mason, I didn't think you'd ever find me," Jonathan said, glancing around nervously as he slid into the booth. He was a man in his late 40s, his hair thinning, and his face lined with stress. "I'm glad you agreed to meet, Mr. Pierce," Mason said, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "I understand you worked closely with Mr. Hawkins before his passing, Anything you can tell me would be helpful. Jonathan looked around again, making sure no one was listening. I need you to understand something, Detective. Charles Hawkins was a brilliant man. He built an empire from nothing. But his wife, Julia, she was a different story. Mason leaned forward, his interest piqued. What do you mean? Jonathan took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. Julia, she was always interested in the business. I don't think Charles ever truly saw it. He loved her, yes, but he didn't realize just how much she wanted to take over. She knew what was coming. She knew that his health was deteriorating. There were conversations I overheard in the office. Things she said about taking control, about the future of the company. Mason's mind raced. This was the first concrete evidence he had that Julia's ambition extended beyond the socialite lifestyle. It wasn't just about the wealth. It was about power, control of Hawkins Industries. Did you hear anything specific about her plans? Mason asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jonathan hesitated for a moment before speaking in a low voice. There was talk of a life insurance policy. It wasn't a regular policy either. It was one that would pay out in the event of a sudden death, a high payout. I don't know all the details, but I know Julia had access to the documents. She was going to be the sole beneficiary. Mason's eyes widened. This was it. This was the link he needed to tie Julia directly to Charles's death. The life insurance policy wasn't just a financial cushion. It was a motive. Do you have any proof of this? Mason asked urgently. Jonathan nodded. I do. I wasn't the only one who knew about it. A few of us in the finance department had access to those documents. Julia she was very controlling when it came to the company's finances. She made sure she was always in the loop. I even overheard her discussing a plan to speed up Charles's death. She knew he was weak. She knew he'd never last through the year. Mason's heart raced as he processed the information. This was the missing piece. The life insurance payout wasn't just a coincidence. It was the final step in a plan that Julia had orchestrated, a plan to kill her husband and claim the business as her own. Mr. Pierce, I need you to help me. I need you to provide me with any documentation or emails that prove what you've just told me, Mason said, his tone firm. Jonathan nodded reluctantly. I'll help you, Detective. But you need to understand, I was just an employee. I didn't want to get involved. But now I see what she did to him. Mason nodded, thanking Jonathan for his cooperation. He knew that this would be the key to taking down Julia Hawkins. But even with this new information, he had to be careful. Julia was no amateur. She had covered her tracks well. It would take more than just a few financial documents to bring her down. The next step was clear. Mason had to get access to the life insurance policy documents and prove that Julia had played a direct role in Charles's death. He needed a break in the case, something that would show that Julia had deliberately orchestrated her husband's death. Mason spent the next few days working with financial experts, forensic accountants, and investigators. They combed through the records, carefully reviewing every transaction, every communication. They found evidence of Julia's access to Charles's financial affairs, including the life insurance policy that had been adjusted just months before his death. It was clear now that Julia had been planning her husband's demise for some time. She had manipulated his health issues, taken advantage of his deteriorating condition, and made sure that everything was in place for when the time came. But Mason knew he couldn't act on this alone. He needed to bring in the rest of the team, and he needed to act fast before Julia suspected anything. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The next day, Mason received an unexpected call. It was from his colleague, Detective Sarah Thompson. Robert, I've got something, Sarah said, her voice urgent. I've just spoken with a confidential informant. Julia is planning a meeting with her lawyer tomorrow to finalize everything. She's moving quickly, and she's already looking ahead to her future. She's planning to sell off part of Hawkins Industries to a private investor. Mason's pulse quickened. This was the break he had been waiting for. If Julia was meeting with her lawyer to finalize everything, it meant she was about to make her next move. She was getting ready to take control of the company, to ensure her place at the top. I need you to get a warrant for that meeting, Mason said. We need to be there when she signs the papers. This is our chance to catch her in the act. Sarah's voice crackled over the phone. You've got it, Robert. I'll get the paperwork ready. As Mason hung up the phone, He felt a renewed sense of urgency. The walls were closing in on Julia Hawkins. She had manipulated her way to the top, but Mason was ready to expose the truth. The city was alive with the sounds of traffic and bustling crowds. But for Detective Mason, there was only one thing on his mind: catching Julia Hawkins in the act. The case was drawing to a close, and everything had been carefully planned. The trap was set. Now all Mason had to do was wait for Julia to make her move. The information Sarah had uncovered was invaluable. Julia's meeting with her lawyer was scheduled for the following afternoon. The lawyer, a well-known corporate attorney named Richard Harris, had represented Julia in several high-profile cases before. It was clear that this wasn't just a casual meeting. It was the final step in her carefully orchestrated plan to take control of her husband's empire. Mason's team had already obtained a warrant to monitor the meeting. They had bugged the lawyer's office, and a surveillance team had been positioned nearby. This was it, the moment when Julia would either confirm her involvement in her husband's death or manage to slip away scot-free. Mason couldn't afford any mistakes. The morning of the meeting, Mason gathered his team for one final briefing. They gathered around a table in the secure room at the NYPD headquarters. On the table were the final pieces of the puzzle: documents, surveillance plans, and a recording device that would capture the conversation between Julia and her lawyer. "All right," Mason said, addressing the team. "This is the final push. We have the surveillance set up, the warrant is in place, and we've got everything we need to make our move. We're going to be discreet, but we need to make sure we get every detail. We're walking into a lion's den here, so stay sharp." He paused, looking at each member of the team. "Julia Hawkins is smart. She's covered her tracks well, but she's not going to get away with this. We're going to put her in a position where she has no choice but to incriminate herself." The plan was simple. Mason would stay in constant communication with Sarah, who would monitor the surveillance footage in real time. The team would be positioned just outside the building, ready to move in if necessary. If Julia made any incriminating statements, they would have her. If not, they would gather enough evidence to confront her directly and build the case against her. As Mason drove to the location, his mind raced with thoughts of the case. Julia had been so convincing, so calm throughout the investigation. She had played the part of the grieving widow to perfection, but Mason knew the truth now. She had never been sad about losing her husband. She had been calculating, waiting for the right moment to take control of his empire. When Mason arrived at the lawyer's office, he took a deep breath and glanced at the building. It was a sleek, modern building in the heart of Manhattan, an appropriate location for the kind of high-stakes meeting Julia was about to have. The building was quiet, the lobby sparsely populated, but Mason's instincts told him that something big was about to happen. He received a quick text from Sarah, confirming that the surveillance equipment was in place and that the meeting would be starting in less than 30 minutes. Julia had arrived early, looking flawless as ever in a designer dress, her hair perfectly styled. She walked into the office with the same air of confidence she always exuded, her movements calculated and poised. Mason watched her through the glass doors of the building, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Julia Hawkins, the ambitious widow who had orchestrated the death of her elderly husband, was about to seal her fate. Inside the office, Julia sat across from Richard Harris, who was already flipping through some legal documents. Julia's demeanor was calm, but Mason could see the subtle signs of tension beneath the surface. She was a woman who had spent years building a carefully crafted image, and now everything was on the line. "Julia," Harris said, looking up from the paperwork, "I trust everything is in order for the transaction tomorrow?" Julia nodded, her eyes narrowed in thought. "Yes, everything's set. The paperwork is ready to go. It's just a matter of finalizing the transfer of shares and signing the contracts. Once that's done, Hawkins Industries will be mine." Harris smiled, but there was something cold about the exchange. "I have to say, I'm impressed with your persistence. Not many people would go to such lengths to secure their future, but it's all coming together nicely." Julia's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't the smile of a woman who had just lost her husband. It was the smile of a woman who knew she had just won. "Charles was weak," Julia said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. "His health was deteriorating. He would never have made it through the year. I had to act before someone else did. I had to secure what's mine. Mason's pulse quickened as he listened in. This was it, the confirmation he needed. Julia was admitting to orchestrating her husband's death. I had the life insurance policy adjusted, Julia continued, her tone almost clinical. I knew exactly when to pull the trigger. I couldn't risk waiting too long. Charles was never going to hand over control of the company willingly, so I made sure he wouldn't have a choice. And now, it's all mine. Mason's eyes narrowed as he listened to her words. She had planned it all. From the moment she married Charles, she had been positioning herself to take control of his business. The life insurance policy, the manipulation of his health, the way she had orchestrated his decline. It was all part of a carefully executed plan to secure her future. And now, with the business in her grasp, she was about to walk away with everything. But Mason wasn't going to let her get away with it. He signaled to Sarah, who was monitoring the footage in real time. It was time to make their move. Mason and his team moved into position, preparing to confront Julia Hawkins. Inside the lawyer's office, Julia was still speaking, her voice filled with triumph. I'm going to make Hawkins Industries even bigger than Charles ever dreamed. I'll expand it, take it global. I've always known what I wanted, and now I have it. Nothing and no one is going to stop me. Just as she finished speaking, the door to the office opened, and Mason stepped inside. Julia froze, her eyes widening in shock as she looked up at him. For the first time since her husband's death, the mask slipped. Julia Hawkins, Mason said, his voice steady. You're under arrest for the murder of Charles Hawkins. The room was silent as Julia's world came crashing down. She had thought she could outsmart everyone, but in the end it was her own arrogance that had led to her downfall. Mason knew that the real fight was just beginning, but for now he had her, caught in her own web of lies and deceit. The arrest of Julia Hawkins shook the city to its core. From the moment Detective Robert Mason stepped into that sleek lawyer's office and placed her under arrest, the press had latched onto the story with a fervor that could not be contained. The widow of the wealthy and powerful Charles Hawkins, arrested for his murder? It was a headline no one could ignore. As Mason led Julia out of the lawyer's office in handcuffs, the cold smile that had graced her lips earlier had faded. Her polished composure was gone, replaced by a look of disbelief that seemed to linger in her eyes. It was the look of a woman who thought she had outsmarted the world, only to find that the world had finally caught up with her. The media frenzy that followed was intense. Cameras flashed relentlessly as reporters bombarded Mason with questions. The detective didn't answer them, of course. His role wasn't to feed the press. His role was to ensure justice, and that was exactly what he was going to do. Julia Hawkins was no longer the picture-perfect widow. She was a woman facing the cold reality of her crimes, and the truth was about to come out. In the weeks that followed, Mason's team continued to build the case against Julia. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, emails, and phone records all pointed to her involvement in Charles Hawkins's death. But it wasn't just the financial motive that made the case solid. It was the confession she had made in the lawyer's office, the one where she had casually admitted to orchestrating her husband's death. It was clear now that Julia had seen Charles's decline as nothing more than an obstacle to her future, and she had done everything in her power to remove that obstacle. But there was more to this story. During the investigation, Mason uncovered something unexpected. Julia wasn't working alone. She had an accomplice, someone who had helped her manipulate Charles's health, someone who had been involved in adjusting his life insurance policy to ensure she would get the payout. This revelation changed everything. The accomplice turned out to be none other than Dr. Henry Lawson, Charles Hawkins' personal physician. Lawson had been attending to Charles's health for years, and Julia had used her influence over him to ensure that her husband's decline was expedited. Lawson had been the one to alter Charles's medication, increasing the dosage of certain drugs that had contributed to his fragile health. It wasn't a direct cause of death, but it had certainly hastened the inevitable. Detective Mason was stunned by the revelation. Dr. Lawson had been a trusted figure in the Hawkins household, a man who had gained the confidence of both Charles and Julia. It had all been part of Julia's plan, a plan that had required the cooperation of those closest to Charles in order to succeed. When Dr. Lawson was arrested, he initially denied any involvement in the murder. But as the evidence against him mounted, he began to crack. In a tense interrogation session, Mason pressed him on his role in Charles's death. The physician finally admitted to altering Charles's medication at Julia's request, though he claimed he had been coerced by her threats. "I never meant for it to go this far," Dr. Lawson said, his voice shaking. "She told me Charles was too weak, that he needed to go, that he was holding her back from the life she wanted. She promised me money, a large sum. She said she needed to get rid of him to take control of the company. I didn't think she would actually do it. I thought it would just be for a little while, just enough to push him to the edge." Mason's gut twisted with anger as he listened to Dr. Lawson's confession. It was clear now that Julia Hawkins had been a master manipulator, preying on those around her to get what she wanted. She had used her charm and her beauty to deceive everyone, convincing them that she was the grieving widow, when in reality, she was the mastermind behind a cold-blooded plot to kill her husband. Dr. Lawson's confession was crucial in tightening the noose around Julia's neck. With his testimony, Mason knew he had everything he needed to bring her to trial. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle to fit into place: Julia's involvement with the life insurance policy. The insurance payout was substantial, $5 million. But it wasn't just the money that was at stake. The future of Hawkins Industries, the business that Charles had worked his entire life to build, was at the center of this case. Julia had wanted the company, and she had been willing to kill for it. The trial was set to begin soon, and Mason knew it would be a long and difficult road. Julia's defense team was top tier, and they would stop at nothing to discredit the evidence. But Mason wasn't worried. He had done his homework, and he knew the truth. Julia Hawkins was going to face justice for the murder of her husband. On the first day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The media, the public, and even members of the Hawkins family filled the seats, eager to see what would unfold. Julia sat in the defendant's chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was dressed in a conservative black suit, but there was a coldness about her that no amount of makeup or designer clothing could hide. The prosecution opened the case by laying out the timeline of events. They presented evidence of Julia's financial dealings, including the adjusted life insurance policy and the suspicious transfers of funds leading up to Charles's death. They played the recording of Julia's confession to her lawyer, where she had admitted to orchestrating her husband's death for the sake of the company. Julia's defense team fought hard, attempting to paint her as a victim, a grieving widow who had been manipulated by others. They tried to discredit Dr. Lawson's testimony, suggesting that he was lying in order to save himself. But Mason knew the truth. The evidence was irrefutable. As the days passed, the prosecution continued to build their case, presenting witness testimony, financial records, and expert analysis. Julia's defense was starting to crumble under the weight of the evidence. The pieces were falling into place, and Mason could see the doubts starting to form in the jury's minds. Then it was Julia's turn to take the stand. She sat up straighter as she was sworn in, her demeanor poised and calm, as if nothing had changed. But Mason could see the tension in her eyes, the fear that was beginning to show as she realized the walls were closing in around her. Her defense attorney asked her about her relationship with Charles, about the years they had spent together. Julia spoke eloquently, describing her love for her late husband and the pain she felt after his death. She maintained that she had nothing to do with his passing, that it was simply a tragic accident due to his failing health. But Mason wasn't fooled. He had heard the confession, he had seen the evidence, and he knew that Julia Hawkins had planned every step of her husband's murder. She had wanted control of Hawkins Industries, and she had killed for it. When the defense rested, Mason felt a sense of quiet confidence. He knew the case was solid. It was only a matter of time before the jury delivered their verdict. The courtroom was packed as the trial of Julia Hawkins neared its conclusion. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. After weeks of gripping testimony, revelations, and dramatic twists, everyone was waiting for the final verdict. The prosecution had laid out a compelling case, and Julia's defense had fought tooth and nail to cast doubt on her involvement. Now, all that was left was for the jury to deliberate and deliver the final word on the woman accused of orchestrating the brutal murder of her wealthy husband. Detective Robert Mason sat in the front row, watching intently as the defense and prosecution made their closing arguments. The weight of the case had not lifted from his shoulders, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, despite Julia's best efforts, the truth had been exposed. The world now knew what kind of woman she really was. A woman who had manipulated everyone around her husband, her trusted physician, even the people she called friends, just to get what she wanted. Julia Hawkins sat in the defendant's chair, her face betraying little emotion as the defense made their final plea. Her lawyer, a seasoned litigator, argued that there was no concrete evidence to directly link Julia to her husband's death. He maintained that the life insurance policy was simply a routine part of their financial planning and that Dr. Lawson had likely acted on his own in altering Charles's medication. The lawyer painted Julia as a loving wife who had been devastated by her husband's decline, a woman who had no reason to kill him. But Mason knew better. He had heard Julia's own words, the confession that had come so easily, so coldly, when she thought no one was listening. He had seen the meticulous way in which she had set up her husband's death, the way she had manipulated the people around her to ensure the successful execution of her plan. There was no denying it now. Julia Hawkins was guilty. As the defense finished their argument, the prosecutor, a calm and methodical woman named Emily Matthews, stood to address the jury. Her eyes swept the room and then, with a voice that resonated with confidence, she began her closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her gaze steady, "this is not just a case about a murder. This is a case about betrayal. Julia Hawkins did not just betray her husband, she betrayed the trust of everyone around her. She used her beauty, her charm, and her cunning to manipulate everyone who thought they knew her. She carefully orchestrated her husband's death, and now she must face the consequences of her actions." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before continuing. "Over the course of this trial, you've heard the evidence. You've heard from Dr. Lawson, who admitted to altering Charles Hawkins' medication at Julia's request. You've heard the testimony about the life insurance policy, the financial transactions, and the correspondence between Julia and her accomplices. And perhaps most damning of all, you've heard Julia's own confession to her lawyer, in which she admits to planning her husband's death to secure control of his empire." Emily's voice softened as she addressed the jury directly. "This is not just a woman who lost her husband. This is a woman who killed him for her own gain. She took advantage of his failing health and manipulated everyone around her. And now it is time for justice to be served." The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed out to begin their deliberations. Julia sat motionless in her seat, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she were deep in thought. But Mason could see the slight tremor in her hands. The facade she had built so carefully over the years was crumbling, piece by piece. Outside the courtroom, the world was waiting for the decision. The media had been covering the trial intensely, and cameras were set up outside the courthouse to catch any glimpses of the key players involved. As Mason stepped out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed him, asking for a statement. He ignored them, his mind focused solely on the case at hand. The hours stretched on as the jury deliberated, each minute feeling like an eternity. Mason sat in his office, reviewing the evidence once more, his fingers drumming on the desk in thought. He had seen criminals like Julia before, calculating, ruthless individuals who believed they were untouchable. But in the end, it was always the truth that came to light, and in this case, the truth was undeniable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. Julia stood up, her back straight, her face a mask of determination, but Mason could see the tension in her eyes, the fear that she had tried so hard to hide. She knew this moment would determine her fate. The foreman of the jury stood up and addressed the judge. "Your Honor," the foreman said, his voice clear and steady, "we, the jury, have reached a verdict." The room was silent as the judge nodded. "Please, read the verdict." The foreman turned to Julia, his gaze unwavering. "We find the defendant, Julia Hawkins, guilty of the murder of Charles Hawkins." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Julia's face went pale, her mouth opening slightly in disbelief.